Those who know me well are accustomed to my passionate approach to God's Word. I admit I am quite an intense individual. Everything that must be done deserves to be done well, I say. But let me be clear, I am persuaded that my intensity for the gospel pleases heaven, but it disturbs hell at the same time. And that's a good thing. I will never be accused of lacking passion when it comes to serving the Lord. Speaking of intensity, some have sat under my teachings for 30 years, and to this day, there is a message that remains dear to their hearts. Even though I have shared this lesson years ago, plenty of church members have considered this message to be a breakthrough moment, a time when things start to get better for them. This message was entitled, "The Perils of a Wounded Soul." You know, if the only thing you have in your hand is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail to you. A wounded spirit always finds something to complain about. A wounded spirit always finds some justification for getting aggressive. That is exactly how the believer in the second stage of growth feels like. He or she becomes the victim and the aggressor at the same time. They are in the defensive and the offensive simultaneously. In the vanity of their mind, someone has attacked them and they must therefore reply with force. History offers a lesson that illustrates well the perils of a wounded soul. One just has to consider Adolf Hitler. All his life, he carried a chip on his shoulder. From the Jews to the Poles, from the British to the French, Hitler had an axe to grind with almost everyone. He felt he was treated unfairly. He felt Germany had been treated unfairly. And so, his wounds grew into aggression. From the victim, he became the aggressor. For him, vengeance was reasonable and payback was to be expected. Because of a perceived injustice, the crime was justified. Welcome to the emotional lair of Satan himself. By nourishing a climate of injustice and social unrest, Adolf Hitler was able to lure most of the German people into supporting the Socialist Nazi Party. Simply by rewriting history, everyone fell in love with their new champion. The common folks bought his sad story, and the Führer was elected by a majority. In just a few short years, Hitler moved from prison to palace, from a zero to a hero, simply by repeating misleading slogans and twisted fables to those who knew very little about historical facts. As you can see, he who controls the media controls the masses. In the end, there wouldn't have been a World War II without Adolf Hitler. Always beware of the perils of a wounded soul. Because of perceived injury, the victim always carries the feeling of injustice. And when injustice is perceived, retribution is next. The wounded soul may feel totally right in looking for payback. Many wars have been triggered by wounded souls. Many people have died because of a perceived offense. German Kaiser Wilhelm II is a great example of a wounded soul. There would not have been a World War I without Kaiser Wilhelm II. The German monarch was born with a left arm shorter than the other. Let me explain why. Because the Kaiser's mother was British, she gave birth with the help of British doctors who injured the baby during childbirth. And so, even though Kaiser Wilhelm II was half German and half British, he always held a grudge against England. In his mind, the physical deformity he suffered was nothing but a British blunder. So to compensate, the Kaiser was always complaining about British royalty. Yet he longed to be accepted by every one of them. He competed against everyone, and at the same time, he wanted to befriend everyone. That is not a good mix in politics, nor in life. And so his wounds grew into aggression. Within a few short years after his accession to the throne of Germany, millions had died in the battlefield of the Great War. I repeat, always beware of the perils of a wounded soul. A similar story is observed in the life of Joseph Stalin. The Soviet dictator also had an axe to grind with everyone. Stalin even had his own wife murdered because he felt she had betrayed him. I repeat, when injustice is perceived, retribution is next. And that's exactly what Stalin did to everyone around him. They were all murdered. Just like Kaiser Wilhelm II, a childhood accident had left Stalin with a shorter than the other arm. Due to this infirmity, he carried the feelings of inadequacy, so he had to compensate. Due to this infirmity, he carried the feelings of injustice, so everyone had to pay. The Poles, the Ukrainians, the Jews, even Russians were murdered by the millions by the mad dictator. In fact, there wouldn't have been the Cold War without Joseph Stalin. Always beware of the perils of a wounded soul. Now, before we end this episode, let's turn our attention to the most infamous wounded soul of them all, Lucifer, the devil himself. Satan is the greatest failure of history. No one has fallen from so high to so low. Because the Almighty has rejected him, Satan carries in his bitter soul the poison of unforgiveness. In his rage against God, he seeks to corrupt and deface God's creation by spreading his venom of unforgiveness in the heart of man. Beware of the perils of this wounded soul. Now, once again, let's visit the Hall of Fame of Wounded Souls. Had Kaiser Wilhelm II forgiven his enemies, there would not have been a World War I. Had Adolf Hitler forgiven his enemies, there would not have been a World War II. Had Joseph Stalin forgiven his enemies, there would not have been a Cold War. And had Satan obeyed the Almighty, I would not be here sharing with you the power and forgiveness. Please, I urge you, do not walk around as a wounded soul. Forgive everyone and forget the past, for where you will spend eternity depends on it. This is Pastor Stéphane Chauvette, and this was the Word for Today.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of A Word for Today. If you like discovering the footsteps of God through the message of Pastor Stéphane, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. For more exclusive content, visit us at awordfortoday.ca. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please don't forget to leave your questions and comments so we can interact with you. We might use your inputs in an upcoming program. Back to you, Brent.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for joining us on A Word for Today today. Our quote of today is from Charles Spurgeon, a British pastor and author from the 19th century who is known as the Prince of Preachers. He said, "A Bible that's falling apart usually belongs to someone who isn't."
You got that right, Brent.
There you go. Please be sure to join us again next time. We look forward to it.
Good night, everyone.